The metallic taste of betrayal never leaves your mouth. But watching my sister collapse at my engagement party while wearing my wedding dress came pretty close to washing it away. The glass of red wine I was supposed to drink sat untouched on the marble countertop, its bitter almond scent still haunting my memory 3 years later. If I hadn't trusted my instincts that night, if I hadn't switched our glasses when that strange smell hit my nostrils, I would be 6 feet underground instead of standing in the executive boardroom of Sullivan and Associates, watching my former fiancé's law firm crumble beneath the weight of their own corruption. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The irony wasn't lost on me that the man who tried to poison me on the night we were supposed to celebrate our future together was now begging me to represent his firm in the biggest legal scandal to hit Portland in decades. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how satisfying it felt to watch James Morrison's perfectly sculpted face crumble when I walked into that boardroom, you need to know how it all began. My name is Elena Vasquez, and 3 years ago I was a naive public defender who believed that love could conquer anything, including the growing distance between myself and my Harvard-educated fiancé. I thought our differences made us stronger, his corporate law background balancing my passion for social justice, his family's old money complementing my immigrant parents' work ethic. I was so focused on building a life together that I completely missed the signs that James had been building an exit strategy for months. The engagement party was supposed to be a celebration of our future, held at the Morrison family estate in the hills overlooking the Columbia River. The sprawling property had been in James's family for 4 generations, a testament to old Portland money and the kind of established privilege I was still learning to navigate. My parents, Maria and Carlos Vasquez, looked slightly overwhelmed by the opulence as they mingled with partners from Morrison, Burke and Associates, but they wore their best clothes and brightest smiles, proud that their daughter was marrying into such an established family. I remember feeling beautiful that night, wearing a flowing emerald dress that brought out my dark eyes, my long black hair swept into an elegant updo that had taken my sister Isabella 2 hours to perfect. Isabella, 3 years younger and infinitely more trusting than I ever was, had insisted on doing my hair and makeup, treating the evening like the fairy tale wedding preview she believed it to be. She wore a simple black dress, understated and elegant, content to let me shine as the bride-to-be. The party was everything the Morrison family did, perfectly orchestrated, tastefully expensive, and designed to impress rather than celebrate. Crystal champagne flutes caught the light from antique chandeliers, servers in crisp white uniforms, circulated with hors d'oeuvres that cost more than my monthly student loan payment, and conversations flowed in the practiced cadence of people accustomed to networking, disguised as socializing. James moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone born to these gatherings, his tall frame commanding attention in a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my car. His sandy brown hair was perfectly styled, his blue eyes bright with what I interpreted as happiness, but would later recognize as relief. He introduced me to his colleagues and family friends, with the right mix of pride and possession, his hand resting possessively on my lower back as we navigated from group to group. My mother approached me near the kitchen, carrying 2 glasses of red wine on a silver tray. "Misha," she said in her accented English, "Mrs. Morrison asked me to bring you this. She said it's from their private collection, something special for the bride-to-be." Her tone carried the slight strain it always held around James's family, the careful politeness of someone who sensed she wasn't entirely welcome but was determined to maintain dignity. I accepted the glass, noting how the deep burgundy liquid caught the light, but as I raised it toward my lips, a strange smell hit my nostrils. It wasn't the rich, fruity aroma I expected from expensive wine. Instead, there was something sharp and chemical underneath, a bitter almond scent that made my stomach clench with instinctive warning. Years of watching my father work as a hospital janitor had taught me to trust unusual odors, cleaning chemicals, medical supplies, things that didn't belong in certain contexts. Isabella appeared at my elbow, slightly breathless from dancing with one of James's law school friends. "Is that the special wine Mrs. Morrison was talking about?" She made such a big deal about it, being from their family vineyard. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity and champagne-induced excitement. Without really thinking about it, I switched our glasses. Here, you try it first. Tell me what you think. The action was casual, sisterly, the kind of thing we'd done 1,000 times growing up when sharing food or drinks. Isabella was always more adventurous with new flavors, more willing to try things I approached with caution. She raised the glass to her lips and took a generous sip, then another. It's different, she said, swirling the liquid thoughtfully. Kind of bitter, but maybe that's just because it's so expensive. Rich people always like things that taste weird. She laughed and took another drink, her natural warmth making light of the unusual flavor. Within minutes, Isabella's laughter became forced, then strained. Her cheeks flushed an unnatural shade of red, and she began swaying slightly, gripping my arm for balance. Elena, I feel strange, she whispered, her voice taking on a quality I'd never heard before, thin and distant, like she was speaking from the bottom of a well. The next few moments unfolded with surreal clarity. Isabella's legs buckled, and she collapsed against me, her weight suddenly dead and terrifying in my arms. The wine glass shattered against the marble floor, dark liquid spreading like blood across the pristine white stone. Around us, conversation died as guests turned to stare, their faces reflecting shock and confusion. Call 911. I screamed, lowering Isabella to the floor and checking her pulse. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and her breathing was shallow and labored. James appeared beside me, his face a mask of concern that somehow seemed rehearsed, as if he'd been preparing for this moment. What happened? He asked, kneeling beside us, but his eyes weren't on Isabella, they were on me, studying my face with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. There was something calculating in his expression, a coldness that I'd never seen before. She drank the wine your mother sent over, I said, my voice shaking as I stroked Isabella's hair. There was something wrong with it. It smelled strange. James's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That's impossible. Mother wouldn't serve anything that wasn't perfect. But his protest sounded hollow, and I caught him glancing toward the kitchen where his mother stood, frozen, her face pale as parchment. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, though it felt like hours. They worked efficiently, checking Isabella's vital signs, and asking rapid-fire questions about what she'd consumed. When I mentioned the wine and its unusual smell, they exchanged significant looks and immediately began treating her for possible poisoning. We need to take her to the hospital immediately, the lead paramedic announced. This appears to be cyanide poisoning. The bitter almond smell is a classic indicator. The word cyanide hit the gathering like a physical blow. Guests began backing away, voices rising in panic and confusion. Morrison appeared beside James, her usually composed face cracked with what looked like genuine horror. That's impossible, she repeated, echoing her son's earlier words. The wine came from our private collection. It's been in our cellar for years. As the paramedics prepared to transport Isabella, I caught a fragment of conversation between James and his mother. They stood slightly apart from the crowd, their voices low but urgent. This wasn't supposed to happen, Mrs. Morrison hissed. You assured me she would be the one to drink it. She switched the glasses, James replied, his voice tight with frustration. I don't know why. Elena never shares drinks. The implication hit me like ice water in my veins. They had been talking about me. The wine had been intended for me, not Isabella. My own fiancé and his mother had tried to poison me at our engagement party. I rode in the ambulance with Isabella, holding her hand as she drifted in and out of consciousness. The paramedics worked to stabilize her, administering oxygen and monitoring her heart. She's lucky, one of them told me quietly. Cyanide poisoning is usually fatal within minutes. The fact that she's still breathing means she didn't get a full dose. At the hospital, while Isabella fought for her life in the ICU, I sat in the waiting room, trying to process what I'd overheard. The logical part of my mind insisted I must have misunderstood, that there had to be another explanation. But the growing certainty in my gut told me otherwise. James and his mother had orchestrated this. They had tried to kill me, and my sister was paying the price for their failure. My parents arrived within an hour,
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Their faces etched with terror and confusion. "What happened?" Michel, my father asked, his work-roughened hands shaking as he reached for me. "The police said something about poison." I told them what I could, leaving out my suspicions about James and his mother. There would be time for that conversation later, after Isabella was stable, after I had more evidence than overheard fragments of conversation. My parents needed to focus on their younger daughter's recovery, not on the possibility that their elder daughter's fiancé was a would-be murderer. James arrived an hour later, having stayed behind to deal with the police and the remaining guests. He played his part perfectly, the concerned fiancé, the shocked victim of a terrible accident. He brought coffee and spoke in soothing tones about how grateful he was that I was safe, how horrible it was that Isabella had been caught in what must have been some kind of terrible mistake. "The police are investigating," he told me, settling into the uncomfortable waiting room chair beside me. "They've taken the wine bottle and the broken glass for testing. Mother is beside herself with worry about how this could have happened." I studied his face as he spoke, looking for cracks in his performance. His blue eyes met mine with apparent sincerity. His voice carried the right notes of concern and confusion, but something felt off. There was a distance in his manner, as if he were playing a role rather than experiencing genuine emotion. "Why did you switch glasses with Isabella?" he asked suddenly, the question seemingly casual but carrying an undertone I couldn't quite identify. "I don't know," I lied, not ready to reveal my suspicions. "The wine smelled strange. I wanted her to try it first, see if I was imagining things." He nodded thoughtfully. "That probably saved your life, if there really was something wrong with that specific glass." The way he said it, with just the right amount of concern and relief, made my skin crawl. It sounded like he was testing the official story, seeing how well it would hold up under scrutiny. Isabella survived the night, though it took 3 days before the doctors were confident she would make a full recovery. The cyanide levels in her blood were significant, but not fatal, suggesting she had indeed received only a partial dose. The police investigation concluded that the poisoning was likely accidental, a contaminated wine bottle from the Morrison family's private collection, possibly the result of improper storage or handling. I wanted to believe it was an accident. I wanted to trust that the man I'd planned to marry was incapable of attempted murder, but the conversation I'd overheard haunted me, and I began noticing things about James that I'd previously overlooked or explained away, like how he'd been pushing me to update my life insurance policy recently, suggesting I increase the coverage now that we were getting married, how he'd been unusually interested in my work schedule, asking detailed questions about my cases and court appearance, how he'd suggested I might want to consider changing law firms after our wedding, perhaps joining Morrison Burke and Associates where he could keep an eye on me. The engagement ring on my finger, a 2-carat diamond that had belonged to his grandmother, began to feel like a shackle rather than a symbol of love. Every time James kissed me or held my hand, I found myself wondering if he was calculating how much my death would benefit him, whether through insurance money, inheritance, or simply the freedom to pursue other relationships without the messiness of a break. I started paying attention to conversations I'd previously tuned out, particularly those involving the Morrison family's business dealings. James worked at his father's law firm, specializing in corporate law and estate planning for Portland's wealthiest family. The firm had a reputation for discretion and efficiency, handling sensitive matters for clients who valued privacy above all else. During dinner at the Morrison house the week after Isabella's recovery, I listened more carefully to the conversation flowing around the mahogany dining table. Miss Morrison mentioned a recent client, whose wife had died unexpectedly, leaving behind a substantial estate that would now pass to her husband without the complications of divorce proceedings. The way she said it, with a subtle satisfaction, made my blood run cold. "Tragic, of course," she added quickly, "but sometimes these things work out for the best. Marriage can be so complicated when significant assets are involved." James nodded sagely. "Elena understands that, don't you, darling? Your work with domestic violence cases has shown you how messy divorce can get when money is involved." The comment was ostensibly supportive, acknowledging my legal expertise, but something in his tone suggested a deeper meaning. Was he implying that he knew I would understand why murder might seem preferable to divorce for someone in his position? That night, I lay awake beside James in his downtown Portland apartment, listening to his steady breathing, and trying to reconcile the man I thought I knew with the growing suspicions taking root in my mind. The James I'd fallen in love with was ambitious but ethical, privileged but not cruel. He'd supported my work as a public defender, even when his family made subtle comments about the undesirable elements I dealt with in criminal court. But, as I reviewed our relationship with new eyes, I began seeing patterns I'd missed. How he'd isolated me from some of my law school friends, suggesting they were jealous of our relationship or that they didn't understand our dynamic. How he'd discouraged me from taking certain cases, particularly those involving domestic violence or financial crimes, claiming he worried about my safety. How he'd been particularly interested in my family's immigration story, asking detailed questions about my parents' legal status and financial situation, that seemed oddly intrusive at the time. Now I wondered if he'd been calculating whether my death would create complications with my family, whether they would have the resources or legal standing to challenge whatever inheritance arrangements he might have planned. The next morning, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of my life. Instead of going to work, I called in sick and spent the day at the downtown library, researching everything I could find about suspicious deaths in Portland over the past 5 years. What I discovered made my blood run cold. 3 women had died under circumstances that shared disturbing similarities with what had almost happened to me. All 3 had been engaged or newly married to men from prominent Portland families. All 3 had died from seemingly accidental poisoning, one from contaminated shellfish at a restaurant, one from tainted medication, one from carbon monoxide exposure in her garage. In each case, the women had substantial life insurance policies that had been recently updated. In each case, their deaths had allowed their partners to avoid complicated divorce proceedings or inheritance disputes. And in each case, the investigations had been cursory, the deaths ruled accidental by authorities who seemed reluctant to question the word of grieving widowers from influential families. Most chilling of all, Morrison, Burke and Associates had handled the legal affairs for 2 of the 3 widowers. I spent the rest of the week conducting my own investigation, using skills I'd developed as a public defender to dig into public records and court filings. The pattern became increasingly clear. James's family law firm specialized in more than just estate planning. They were facilitating the elimination of inconvenient wives and fiancés, making it look like accidents while ensuring their clients inherited substantial assets without legal complications. The wine at our engagement party hadn't been a random accident, or even a crime of passion. It had been a calculated business decision, executed with the cold efficiency that had made Morrison, Burke and Associates one of Portland's most successful law firms. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated me. The woman James had fallen in love with, or pretended to fall in love with, was an idealistic public defender who trusted too easily, and believed too deeply in the goodness of people. The woman who was going to destroy him was someone else entirely, a prosecutor in the making, armed with evidence and motivated by the knowledge that her sister had nearly died for their greed. I began building my case methodically, the way I'd learned to approach complex legal challenges. First, I needed more evidence about the Morrison family's involvement in the suspicious deaths. Second, I needed to protect myself while gathering that evidence. And third, I needed to find a way to bring them to justice without becoming their next victim. The first step was establishing a paper trail. I opened a safety deposit box at a bank across town, where I stored copies of everything I'd discovered about the 3 suspicious deaths. I wrote detailed accounts of what I'd overheard at the engagement party, and my growing suspicions about the Morrison family's activity. Most importantly, I documented my concerns about my own safety, including specific instructions for how the information should be used if anything happened to me. The second step was more delicate, continuing to play the role of the unsuspecting fiancé while gathering additional evidence. This meant attending Morrison family gatherings, participating in conversations about the law firm's clients, and maintaining my relationship with James. despite the revulsion I felt every time he touched me. It also meant protecting Isabella without alarming her about the true nature of what had happened. I convinced my parents to insist she stay with them for an extended recovery period, claiming the doctors had recommended avoiding stress and social situations that might involve alcohol. Isabella grumbled about missing out on Portland's social scene, but she agreed to spend several weeks at our parents' house in southeast Portland, safely away from any additional accidents the Morrison family might orchestrate. The third step was the most challenging, finding allies within the legal system who would take my suspicions seriously and help me build a case strong enough to bring down one of Portland's most powerful law firms. This was where my work as a public defender became invaluable. I had contacts throughout the courthouse, relationships with prosecutors and investigators who knew my reputation for thoroughness and integrity. I started with Detective Sarah Chen, a homicide investigator I'd worked with on several cases. Sarah was known for her willingness to revisit cold cases when new evidence emerged, and she had a particular interest in crimes against women. Over coffee at a downtown cafe, I laid out my suspicions about the 3 suspicious deaths and their connection to Morrison, Burke and Associates. Sarah listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes in her careful handwriting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup with the expression of someone processing disturbing but not entirely surprising information. I remember 2 of those cases, she finally said. The carbon monoxide poisoning and the contaminated medication. Both times, something felt off about the investigations, but there wasn't enough evidence to pursue it further. The victims' families didn't push for more thorough investigations, and the widowers had solid alibis. What if the alibis were manufactured? I asked. What if the Morrison family has been facilitating these deaths as part of a larger operation? Sarah's expression sharpened. That would be a massive conspiracy involving multiple murders. Do you understand what you're suggesting? We're talking about one of the most respected law firms in Portland. I understand exactly what I'm suggesting, I replied, and I understand that my own life might be in danger if I'm right. But I can't ignore what I heard at the engagement party, and I can't pretend that my sister's poisoning was just a coincidence. Sarah agreed to quietly review the 3 cases, looking for connections I might have missed and evidence that hadn't been properly investigated. She also agreed to help me document my ongoing relationship with James, creating a record of our interactions that could be used as evidence if something happened to me. Over the following weeks, I lived a double life that required every acting skill I'd never known I possessed. During the day, I continued working as a public defender, handling cases and maintaining my normal routine. In the evenings, I played the devoted fiancé, attending dinners with James's family and discussing wedding plans that I had no intention of following through with. The Morrison family seemed pleased with my apparent recovery from the traumatic accident at our engagement party. Mrs. Morrison made sympathetic comments about how difficult it must have been to see my sister poisoned, while subtly suggesting that we should focus on moving forward rather than dwelling on unpleasant memories. These things happen, she said during one dinner, her voice carrying the practiced sympathy of someone accustomed to offering comfort to grieving clients. Sometimes there are accidents that no one could have prevented. The important thing is that everyone learned from the experience. James nodded agreement, reaching for my hand across the table. Elena has been incredibly strong through all of this. I'm proud of how she's handled such a difficult situation. The touch of his hand, once comforting and familiar, now made my skin crawl. Every gesture of affection felt like a manipulation, every expression of concern like a calculated performance. I began to wonder how long they had been planning my death, whether James had ever genuinely cared for me or if I had been nothing more than a target from the beginning. But I maintained my performance, smiling and nodding at appropriate moments, discussing flower arrangements and venue selections for a wedding that would never happen. Inside, I was building a case that would bring down everything the Morrison family had built on the foundation of murdered wives and grieving widowers. The breakthrough came from an unexpected while researching court records related to the Morrison family's clients. I discovered that James had a brother I'd never heard of, David Morrison, 2 years older and estranged from the family since college. According to public records, David lived in Seattle and worked as a forensic accountant, specializing in white-collar crime investigation. After some internal debate about the risks of contacting him, I decided that David Morrison might be the key to understanding the full scope of his family's criminal enterprise. If he had been estranged from them for years, he might be willing to share information about their activities that I couldn't discover through public records alone. I drove to Seattle on a Saturday morning, telling James I was visiting a law school friend for the weekend. David Morrison worked for a small but respected accounting firm in the downtown area, and I found him in their offices, working through the weekend on what appeared to be a complex financial investigation. He was clearly James's brother, the same sandy brown hair, the same blue eyes, the same tall frame, but where James carried himself with entitled confidence, David seemed more reserved, more thoughtful. When I introduced myself as his brother's fiancé, his expression immediately became guarded. "I haven't spoken to my family in 8 years," he said bluntly. "If you're here to extend an olive branch or invite me to your wedding, you're wasting your time." "I'm here because I think your family tried to kill me," I replied, matching his directness. "And I think they've done it before." The change in his expression was immediate and dramatic. The weariness was replaced by sharp attention, and he gestured for me to sit down in his office. For the next 2 hours I told him everything I'd discovered about the suspicious deaths, the conversation I'd overheard at the engagement party, and my growing certainty that Morrison Burke and Associates was facilitating murders disguised as accidents. David listened with the focused intensity of someone trained to find patterns in complex financial data. When I finished, he was quiet for several minutes, organizing his thoughts with the same methodical approach I'd observed in James, but directed toward very different purposes. "I'm not surprised," he finally said. "I've suspected for years that my father's law firm was involved in activities that went beyond traditional legal services. That's part of why I left Portland and refused to join the family business." "What do you know about their operations?" I asked. David leaned back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "My father has always been obsessed with maintaining the family's social position and financial status. He views marriage as a business transaction, and he's never been particular about how those transactions are resolved when they become inconvenient." He explained that the Morrison family's wealth came not just from their law practice, but from a network of investments and business relationships that benefited from the deaths of inconvenient spouses. Insurance payouts, inheritance transfers, and property acquisitions that might have been complicated by divorce proceedings were simplified when wives died in apparent accidents. "The law firm provides legal cover," David continued. "They handle the estate planning, the insurance policies, the probate proceedings. Everything looks legitimate because they're respected attorneys handling routine legal matters for grieving widowers." "How many women do you think they've killed?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "I don't know," David admitted, "but I've always suspected the 3 cases you mentioned were just the ones that made it into public record. There may be others that were handled more quietly, in other jurisdictions or involving women whose deaths wouldn't attract attention." We talked for another hour about potential evidence and legal strategy. David agreed to help me build a case against his family, partly out of a desire for justice and partly, I suspected, to finally break free from the guilt he carried about his family's crimes. "There's something else you should know," he said as our conversation concluded. "James has been engaged twice before you. Both women broke off the engagements before the weddings could take place." "What happened to them?" I asked, though I was already dreading the answer. "I don't know," David replied, "but they both left Portland shortly after ending their relationships with James. One moved to Europe, one to Australia. Neither of them ever returned." The implication was clear. I had been lucky that my sister had drunk the poisoned wine instead of me, but my luck might not hold if I continued the charade much longer. The Morrison family had experience dealing with women who posed threats to their operations, and geographical distance might not be enough to protect previous victims indefinitely. I returned to Portland that evening with a new sense of urgency and a plan that was both audacious and terrifying. Instead of continuing to gather evidence while maintaining my cover, I was going to force the Morrison family into revealing themselves by giving them an opportunity they couldn't resist. I was going to fake my own death and see how they react. The plan required careful coordination with Detective Chen and David Morrison, both of whom initially tried to talk me out of what they considered an unnecessarily dangerous approach. But I was convinced that catching the Morrison family in the act of celebrating or covering up my supposed death would provide the kind of evidence that no jury could ignore. We spent a week working out the details. Detective Chen arranged for a staged car accident on a remote stretch of highway outside Portland, complete with emergency responders who were aware of the operation. David provided insight into his family's likely reactions and helped predict how they would handle the logistics of my supposed death. The most challenging aspect was maintaining my normal routine while secretly preparing for my disappearance. I had to continue playing the devoted fiancé while quietly arranging for my cases to be transferred to other public defenders and my personal affairs to be handled by people I trusted. Isabella had recovered completely and returned to her normal life, though she remained slightly shaken by the experience. I wanted to tell her what I was planning, but Detective Chen insisted that the fewer people who knew about the operation, the safer everyone would be. Instead, I hugged her tightly when I saw her and made sure she knew how much I loved her, just in case something went wrong. The night before the staged accident, James and I had dinner at an expensive restaurant downtown. He was in an unusually good mood, talking enthusiastically about our wedding plans and the honeymoon trip to Europe he had been planning. His excitement seemed genuine, which made the entire experience even more surreal. "I've been thinking about after the wedding," he said over dessert. "Maybe it's time for you to consider a career change. Public defense is so stressful and you've been through so much lately with Isabella's accident. You could join the firm, work with me on estate planning. It would be much more relaxed." The suggestion that I abandon my legal career to work under his supervision was so perfectly manipulative that I almost admired its audacity. He was positioning it as concern for my well-being, while actually seeking to control my professional life and limit my independence. "That's sweet of you to offer," I replied, maintaining my cover. "But I love my work. I can't imagine giving up criminal law." His smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Well, we can discuss it after the honeymoon. Sometimes people's priorities change after major life events." That night, as I lay beside him for what I hoped would be the last time, I reflected on how completely I had misjudged his character. The man I'd thought I loved had never existed. In his place was someone capable of planning my murder with the same casual efficiency he brought to contract negotiations. The next morning, I kissed him goodbye and told him I was driving to Salem for a court appearance. Instead, I drove to the predetermined location where Detective Chen and her team were waiting to stage my accident. The car they provided was similar to mine but equipped with safety features that would allow me to survive what would appear to be a fatal crash. The staged accident went exactly as planned. The car went off the road and rolled down an embankment, sustaining damage that would be consistent with a fatal crash. Emergency responders arrived on schedule, and I was declared dead at the scene before being secretly transported to a safe location where I could monitor the Morrison family's reactions. Within 2 hours of the accident report reaching Portland, James received the call about my death. Detective Chen had arranged for surveillance of both James and his family, capturing their initial reactions to the news that I had supposedly died in a car crash. The recordings were everything I had hoped for and more disturbing than I had expected. James's first reaction wasn't grief or shock. It was relief, followed immediately by concern about whether the crash would be investigated thoroughly enough to reveal that it wasn't an accident. His phone conversation with his mother revealed the cold calculation behind their entire operation. "This is better than we planned," Miss Morrison said, her voice carrying clearly through the surveillance equipment. "Car accidents are much cleaner than poisoning. There won't be any questions about substances or timing. I need to be careful about how I react," James replied. "People will expect me to be devastated, but I can't overdo it. Excessive grief sometimes makes investigators suspicious." They discussed the logistics of handling my estate, including the life insurance policy James had convinced me to update just months earlier. They talked about the timeline for probate proceedings and how quickly James could access my assets without appearing unseemly. Most chilling of all, they discussed lessons learned from my case that could be applied to future operations. Ms. Morrison noted that the poisoning attempt had been flawed because it relied on my drinking the wine at a specific time, while car accidents could be staged to look completely random. "We'll need to be more careful about background checks," she added, Elena was more suspicious than we anticipated. The next one should be more trusting. The recordings provided exactly the evidence Detective Chen needed to obtain warrants for comprehensive searches of the Morrison family's properties and records. Within 48 hours of my supposed death, teams of investigators were scouring their law offices, homes, and digital records for evidence of their criminal enterprise. What they found exceeded even my worst suspicions about the scope of their operation. The Morrison family had been facilitating murders disguised as accidents for over 15 years, targeting women whose deaths would financially benefit their husbands or fiancé. The law firm's client files contained detailed profiles of potential victims, including assessments of their assets, family relationships, and likelihood of fighting back if they became suspicious. My own file was among the most extensive, documenting everything from my family's immigration status, to my work schedule, to my sister's medical history. They had been planning my death for months, carefully studying my routines and vulnerabilities to find the most effective approach. The evidence also revealed the fates of James's previous fiancées. Both women had indeed fled the country after becoming suspicious of James's intentions, but neither had escaped entirely. One had died in what appeared to be a hiking accident in Switzerland 2 years after leaving Portland. The other had been killed in a hit-and-run accident in Sydney just 18 months after relocating to Australia. The Morrison family's network extended far beyond Portland, with contacts in multiple countries who could arrange accidents for women who threatened their operations by surviving initial attempts or fleeing to other jurisdictions. But their most ambitious project had been my work as a public defender had made me a particularly attractive target because my death would eliminate someone who understood criminal law and might eventually pose a threat to their operation. They had planned to inherit my assets while simultaneously removing a potential future obstacle to their continued activities. The irony wasn't lost on me that their attempt to eliminate a threat had instead created their most dangerous enemy. By trying to kill me, they had transformed me from a naive public defender into a prosecutor, with intimate knowledge of their operations, and an unshakable motivation to bring them to justice. 3 days after my supposed death, while the Morrison family was planning my funeral and dividing my assets, I walked into the Portland Police Bureau's headquarters to begin the process of destroying everything they had built on the foundation of murdered women. The press conference announcing their arrests drew national attention, partly because of the scale of their crimes and partly because of the unusual circumstances of my survival. The story of the fiancé who faked her own death to expose her would-be killers captured public imagination, but for me it was just the beginning of a longer journey toward justice. James's face when I walked into the courtroom for his arraignment was everything I had hoped it would be and more. The man who had tried to poison me at our engagement party, who had planned my murder with the casual efficiency of a business transaction, who had celebrated news of my supposed death as a successful investment strategy, sat frozen in shock as he realized that his entire world was about to collapse. But that moment of perfect justice, satisfying as it was, represented only the first chapter of my new life. The woman who had trusted too easily and believed too deeply in love had died in that staged car accident. In her place was someone harder and wiser, someone who understood that true strength came not from believing in the goodness of others, but from protecting yourself against those who would exploit that belief. The 3 years since that day have been a journey of rebuilding myself from the ground up, creating a life based on my own values rather than someone else's expectation. But before I tell you about the woman I became, you need to understand the full scope of what the Morrison family had built and how completely we destroyed it in the trials that followed my resurrection from the dead. The trials began 18 months after my staged death, and by then I had transformed into someone the Morrison family never could have anticipated. The naive public defender who had trusted her fiancé's family was gone, replaced by a federal prosecutor specializing in organized crime and conspiracy cases. The FBI had recruited me specifically for my intimate knowledge of the Morrison operation, and I had spent those months learning to think like the criminals I was now dedicated to destroying. My new identity as a prosecutor wasn't just professional revenge, though that element certainly provided motivation. It was a fundamental recognition that my experience with the Morrison family had revealed systemic weaknesses in how the legal system handled crimes against women, particularly when those crimes were committed by people with wealth and social connection. I wanted to ensure that no other woman would face what I had endured, and that no other family would profit from murder disguised as accident. The federal case against Morrison, Burke and Associates ultimately encompassed 23 suspicious deaths across 12 states and 4 countries, spanning a 15-year period. What had started as my personal quest for justice had uncovered one of the most sophisticated murder-for-hire operations in American legal history. The Morrison family hadn't just been killing inconvenient wives and fiancés, they had been running a full-service elimination business for wealthy clients who needed to resolve marital problems without the complications of divorce proceedings. James Morrison faced 17 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and racketeering charges that carried potential death sentences in 3 different states. His mother, Patricia Morrison, faced similar charges as the operational architect of their enterprise. Their law firm's senior partners were charged with conspiracy and accessory charges for their roles in facilitating the legal framework that made the murders possible, but the person I was most interested in prosecuting was Dr. Margaret Whitfield, the Morrison family's poison specialist who had been providing them with untraceable toxins for over a decade. Dr. Whitfield was a respected biochemist who taught at Portland State University, while secretly developing custom poisons for clients who could afford her considerable fees. The wine that had nearly killed me and had poisoned Isabella contained one of her signature compounds, a modified cyanide derivative that was designed to mimic natural causes of death. Dr. Whitfield's laboratory, hidden in the basement of her suburban home, contained enough poison to kill hundreds of people. Her detailed records revealed the specific toxins used in each of the Morrison family's operations, along with her ongoing research into new compounds that would be even more difficult for medical examiners to detect. She had been working on a poison that would cause symptoms resembling sudden cardiac arrest, with no traces remaining in the victim's system after 48 hours. The investigation of her activities led to the discovery of similar operations in other cities, a network of poison specialists serving wealthy clients who needed to eliminate inconvenient spouses, business partners, or family members. Dr. Whitfield had been training other chemists in her techniques, spreading her knowledge through what amounted to a murder university for people with advanced degrees and flexible ethics. My role as lead prosecutor on the federal case meant that I spent months preparing for trials that would determine whether the Morrison family would face execution for their crimes. It also meant that I had to relive the details of my own near murder repeatedly, testifying before grand juries and preparing evidence that would convince skeptical defense attorneys that such an elaborate conspiracy could actually exist. The defense strategy employed by James's legal team was predictably manipulative, attempting to portray me as a vindictive ex-fiancé who had fabricated evidence to frame an innocent man. They argued that the staged car accident proved I was willing to go to extreme lengths to destroy James's reputation, and that my subsequent career change to federal prosecution demonstrated an unhealthy obsession with revenge rather than justice. James's lead attorney, an expensive specialist in white-collar crime defense, painted a picture of me as an unstable woman who had misinterpreted innocent conversations and constructed an elaborate fantasy of persecution to explain why my engagement had ended. He suggested that Isabella's poisoning had been a genuine accident, possibly the result of contaminated glassware or cross-contamination from cleaning supplies, and that my guilt over my sister's suffering had driven me to create a conspiracy theory that blamed my fiancé's family. The strategy might have worked with a different prosecutor, someone without my intimate knowledge of the Morrison family's operations, and my detailed documentation of their activity, but I had spent 3 years preparing for this moment, building an unassailable case that would survive any attempt to discredit my motives or question my credibility. The key breakthrough in the prosecution came from an unexpected source: David Morrison's financial analysis of his family's business operation. David had spent 2 years secretly documenting the financial flows that connected Morrison, Burke and Associates to their murder-for-hire activities, tracing insurance payouts, inheritance transfers, and legal fees that revealed the full scope of their criminal enterprise. His analysis showed that the Morrison family had generated over $12 million in revenue from their elimination service, with individual contracts ranging from $50,000 for simple poisoning cases to over $500,000 for complex operations that required multiple attempts or international coordination. They had been operating as a business, with detailed cost-benefit analyses for different murder methods and careful reinvestment of profits into expanding their capability. The financial evidence was particularly damning because it showed clear patterns that correlated with the suspicious deaths we had identified. Every time a Morrison client's wife died in an apparent accident, significant fees flowed into the law firm's accounts within weeks of the death. Insurance settlements and inheritance transfers consistently benefited Morrison clients at rates that far exceeded statistical probability for natural deaths or genuine accidents. David's testimony about his family's activities was devastating to their defense. As someone who had grown up within the Morrison family and understood their methods intimately, he could explain the subtle signs that had convinced him to leave Portland and distance himself from their operations. His decision to cooperate with federal prosecutors despite the personal cost demonstrated the strength of the evidence against his family. The trial of James Morrison began on a cold February morning in federal court, with media attention that had attracted reporters from across the country. The courtroom was packed with families of the Morrison family's victims, law enforcement officials, and legal professionals who wanted to witness what many considered the most significant prosecution of organized crime in Oregon's history. James had aged considerably during the months of investigation and preparation for trial. The confident, privileged attorney who had tried to poison me at our engagement party now appeared hollow and desperate, his expensive suits unable to conceal the toll that impending prosecution had taken on his health and appearance. He avoided eye contact with me throughout the proceedings, though I occasionally caught him staring when he thought I wasn't looking, his expression mixing hatred with something that might have been regret. My opening statement to the jury focused on the systematic nature of the Morrison family's crimes rather than the personal details of my own experience. I wanted the jury to understand that this wasn't about a failed relationship or individual revenge, but about a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for 15 years, because its victims were women whose deaths benefited powerful men with the resources to avoid scrutiny. I outlined the evidence we would present. Financial records showing the flow of money from grieving widowers to Morrison, Burke and Associates, testimony from Dr. Whitfield about the specific poisons used in each murder, recorded conversations between James and his mother, celebrating the deaths of their victims, and documentation of the elaborate planning that went into each elimination operation. The prosecution's case unfolded over 6 weeks, with witnesses who painted a picture of calculated cruelty that shocked even experienced court observers. Medical examiners testified about evidence of poisoning that had been overlooked or misinterpreted in original investigation. Insurance investigators described patterns of suspicious claims that had been approved without adequate scrutiny. International law enforcement officials explained how the Morrison network had operated across borders to eliminate women who had fled the United States, seeking safety. One of the most powerful witnesses was Dr. Linda Chen, a toxicologist who had analyzed the wine that poisoned Isabella. Dr. Chen's testimony revealed that the specific compound used in the wine had been custom designed to cause maximum suffering, while minimizing the chances of survival. The poison was intended to cause a slow, agonizing death that would give the appearance of natural illness rather than deliberate murder. The fact that Isabella had survived was due to a combination of her youth, her body weight, and the medical intervention she had received within minutes of consuming the poison. Chen testified that if I had drunk the wine as intended, my smaller body weight and the delayed medical attention that would have resulted from being at a social gathering, rather than immediately rushed to a hospital, would have made survival virtually impossible. Whitfield's testimony was particularly damaging to James's defense. She described in clinical detail how she had developed the specific poison used in my case, explaining that James had requested a compound that would cause immediate incapacitation followed by death within 30 minutes. He had specified that the poison should be undetectable in wine and should cause symptoms that could be attributed to an allergic reaction or sudden illness. The recording of James's conversation with his mother after my supposed death was played for the jury multiple times, each repetition revealing new layers of callousness in their casual discussion of my elimination. The jury heard James express satisfaction that the car accident had been cleaner than the poisoning attempt, and his mother's suggestions for how to improve their methods for future operations. But the most devastating evidence came from the Morrison family's own records, which revealed the scope of their planning for my murder. They had been monitoring my activities for months, documenting my work schedule, my family relationships, and my personal habits, to identify the most effective approach for eliminating me without raising suspicion. Their files contained photographs of me leaving my apartment, detailed maps of my daily routes, and assessments of various methods for staging my death. They had considered making it appear that I had been killed by one of my criminal defense clients, but had ultimately decided that poisoning at the engagement party would be more effective because it would occur in a controlled environment where they could manage the aftermath. The defense's case was built around creating reasonable doubt about the Morrison family's intentions and suggesting alternative explanations for the evidence. James's attorneys argued that the conversations captured by surveillance could be interpreted as discussions about legitimate legal business rather than murder conspiracy. They suggested that the financial flows identified by David Morrison could represent normal legal fees rather than payments for elimination service. They brought in their own expert witnesses to challenge the toxicology evidence, arguing that the poisoning could have been accidental contamination rather than deliberate murder. They suggested that Dr. Whitfield was a rogue operator who had deceived the Morrison family about the nature of the substances she was providing, claiming that James and his mother believed they were purchasing legitimate pharmaceuticals for research purposes. The defense strategy reached its most desperate point when they attempted to argue that I had poisoned Isabella myself as part of an elaborate scheme to frame James for attempted murder. They suggested that my subsequent career change to federal prosecution and my detailed knowledge of the Morrison family's activities proved that I had been planning their downfall from the beginning of our relationship. This line of argument backfired spectacularly when it allowed me to present additional evidence about the Morrison family's activities that might not have been admissible otherwise. The defense's suggestion that I had fabricated evidence opened the door for me to introduce even more damning documentation of their crimes, including communications with criminal contacts in other countries, and detailed plans for expanding their elimination services to new markets. The trial's turning point came during James's own testimony, when his attorneys made the strategic error of putting him on the witness stand to deny the charges against him. James had always been confident in his ability to manipulate people through charm and apparent sincerity, and his legal team believed that his personal testimony would humanize him for the jury and create doubt about the prosecution's claim. Instead, James's testimony revealed the depth of his narcissism and his inability to comprehend the severity of his crimes. Under cross-examination, he consistently referred to the murdered women as problems that had needed to be resolved rather than human beings whose lives had been stolen. He expressed frustration that the investigation had disrupted his legal career, and suggested that the prosecution was motivated by personal vendetta rather than legitimate law enforcement concern. Most damaging of all, James attempted to justify his actions by arguing that the women he had helped eliminate were obstacles to their husbands' happiness and financial security. He claimed that the Morrison family had been providing a valuable service by helping their clients resolve marital difficulties without the complications and expenses of divorce proceedings. When I cross-examined James about the specific details of my case, his mask of respectability completely slipped. He became angry and defensive, accusing me of betraying his trust by recording conversations and staging my own death. He complained that I had violated the privacy of his family by involving law enforcement in what he characterized as a personal dispute between former romantic partners. The moment that sealed James's conviction came when I asked him to explain why he had expressed relief upon hearing news of my supposed death, rather than grief over losing his fiancé. His response revealed everything the jury needed to know about his character and motivation. "You have to understand," he said, leaning forward in the witness chair with an expression of frustrated condescension. Elena had become a liability to our family's reputation and business interests. Her work as a public defender brought her into contact with criminal elements that were inappropriate for someone in our social position. Her death would have resolved those concerns while allowing us to maintain our dignity and social standing. The courtroom was completely silent as the implications of his statement sank in. James had just admitted to viewing my death as a solution to social embarrassment rather than a tragic loss. He had revealed that his primary concern upon learning of my supposed death was not grief over losing someone he claimed to love, but relief that a social problem had been eliminated. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against James Morrison. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the complete failure of the defense to create reasonable doubt about James's guilt. Similar verdicts followed for Patricia Morrison and the other defendants, with sentences ranging from life imprisonment without parole to death penalties in states that allowed capital punishment. Dr. Whitfield received the harshest sentence of all the defendants, reflecting the court's recognition that her scientific expertise had made the Morrison family's crimes possible. Her detailed knowledge of chemistry and toxicology had transformed what might have been crude poisoning attempts into sophisticated murder operations that had fooled medical examiners and investigators for over a decade. The civil lawsuits that followed the criminal convictions resulted in the complete financial destruction of the Morrison family and their associates. The families of their victims received settlements totaling over $40 million, funded by the seizure of all Morrison family assets including their Portland estate, their law firm's assets, and investment accounts that had been funded through their criminal activity. But the legal victories, satisfying as they were, represented only one aspect of my transformation during the 3 years following my staged death. The personal journey of rebuilding my identity and learning to trust again proved more challenging than any courtroom battle I had fought. The woman who emerged from the Morrison trials was fundamentally different from the idealistic public defender who had nearly been poisoned at her engagement party. I had developed a harder edge, a skepticism about people's motivations that sometimes made it difficult to form genuine connections with others. The experience of discovering that someone I loved had been planning my murder created lasting trust issues that affected every relationship in my life. My relationship with my family had been strengthened by the shared trauma of Isabella's poisoning and the knowledge that we had survived a coordinated attack on our family. My parents were proud of my role in bringing the Morrison family to justice, but they worried about the psychological toll that the investigation and trials had taken on my emotional well-being. Isabella had recovered completely from the physical effects of the poisoning, but she struggled with anxiety and hypervigilance that made it difficult for her to attend social gatherings or accept food or drinks from others. She had undergone extensive therapy to address the trauma of being poisoned and the knowledge that she had nearly died because of her sister's romantic relationship. The bond between Isabella and me had deepened through our shared experience, but it was now complicated by her awareness that she had been an unintended victim of violence directed at me. She sometimes expressed guilt about surviving when so many other women had died, and I struggled with my own guilt about exposing her to danger through my relationship with James. My professional life had flourished in ways I never could have anticipated. The Morrison case had established my reputation as a prosecutor capable of handling complex organized crime cases, and I received offers from law enforcement agencies across the country. I ultimately accepted a position with the Department of Justice, specializing in cases involving violence against women and financial crimes that targeted vulnerable populations. The work was challenging and often emotionally difficult, but it provided a sense of purpose that had been missing from my previous career as a public defender. I was no longer just defending individual clients against criminal charges. I was working to dismantle criminal organizations that preyed on women and families who lacked the resources to protect themselves. My personal life, however, remained complicated by the trust issues and emotional barriers that had developed during my experience with the Morrison family. I had attempted to date occasionally but found it difficult to develop genuine intimacy with anyone when I was constantly analyzing their motivations and looking for signs of deception or manipulation. The men I met through work understood the demands of my career, but often struggled with my emotional unavailability. The men I met through social activities were typically intimidated by my professional reputation and the media attention that still followed me occasionally. The few relationships I had attempted ended when my partners grew frustrated with my inability to trust completely or my tendency to investigate their backgrounds more thoroughly than romantic etiquette typically requires. It was during this period of professional success and personal isolation that I encountered Marcus Rivera, a detective with the Portland Police Bureau who had worked on the periphery of the Morrison investigation. Marcus was a widower whose wife had died of cancer 3 years earlier, and he understood the challenges of rebuilding a life after experiencing profound loss. Our relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and shared understanding of the complexities of law enforcement work. Marcus had followed the Morrison case closely and understood the significance of what I had accomplished, but he was more interested in who I was becoming than in who I had been during the trials. Marcus was patient with my trust issues and my tendency to overanalyze his actions for hidden meaning. He understood that my experience with James had created lasting skepticism about romantic relationships, and he was willing to move slowly while I learned to distinguish between reasonable caution and paranoid hypervigilance. Our first date was deliberately low-key, a coffee meeting at a downtown cafe where we could talk without the pressure of a formal dinner or the intimacy of a private setting. We discussed our work, our families, and our shared interest in criminal justice reform. The conversation was easy and natural, free from the subtle manipulation and calculated charm that had characterized my interactions with James. Over the following months, Marcus and I developed a friendship that gradually evolved into something deep. He was steady and reliable in ways that allowed me to slowly lower my emotional defenses. He understood my need to maintain independence and control over my environment, and he never pressured me to move faster than I was comfortable with in developing our relationship. The contrast between Marcus and James was stark in every meaningful way. Where James had been charming and manipulative, Marcus was honest and straightforward. Where James had sought to control and isolate me, Marcus encouraged my independence and supported my career ambition. Where James had viewed our relationship as a transaction that should benefit his social and financial position, Marcus saw our partnership as a mutual commitment between equals. Marcus's own experience with loss had taught him to value authentic connection over superficial compatibility. He wasn't interested in changing me or molding me into someone who would enhance his social status. He was attracted to my strength and independence, qualities that James had ultimately found threatening enough to justify murder. Our relationship deepened when Marcus was assigned to investigate a case that had similarities to the Morrison family's operations. A wealthy businessman in Portland had been suspected of poisoning his wife, but the initial investigation had been cursory and the death had been ruled accidental. Marcus asked for my consultation on the case, both because of my expertise in organized crime and because of my specific knowledge of how sophisticated poisoning operations functioned. Working together on the investigation revealed how well our professional skills complemented each other. Marcus's experience as a detective had taught him to notice subtle inconsistencies and to question official narratives that seemed too convenient. My experience as a prosecutor had taught me to think strategically about how to build cases that would survive aggressive defense challenges. The case we were investigating involved Dr. Richard Hawthorne, a prominent surgeon whose wife had died suddenly during a dinner party at their suburban home. The death had been attributed to an allergic reaction to shellfish, despite the fact that Miss Hawthorne had eaten shellfish regularly throughout her adult life with no previous reactions. Our investigation revealed that Dr. Hawthorne had significant gambling debts and had been involved in insurance fraud at the hospital where he worked. His wife's life insurance policy would pay out enough to cover his debts and provide substantial additional funds for his continued gambling. More significantly, Miss Hawthorne had been threatening to divorce him after discovering his gambling problem, which would have left him with insufficient assets to cover his obligations to his creditors. The similarities to the Morrison family's methods were unmistakable. Dr. Hawthorne had used his medical knowledge to administer a poison that would mimic an allergic reaction, and he had done so at a social gathering where the apparent cause of death would be witnessed by multiple people who could testify to the presence of potential allergens. But Dr. Hawthorne had made several crucial mistakes that distinguished his crime from the more sophisticated Morrison operation. He had failed to establish a plausible history of allergic reactions. He had administered too large a dose of the poison, which created symptoms that were inconsistent with genuine allergic reactions, and he had been too obvious in his relief and his rush to collect insurance proceeds. Most importantly, Dr. Hawthorne had acted alone, rather than working with a network of accomplices who could provide alibis and cover stories. His isolation made him vulnerable in ways that the Morrison family's collaborative approach had avoided. Marcus and I spent weeks building a case against Dr. Hawthorne, interviewing witnesses, analyzing medical evidence, and documenting the financial motivations for his wife's murder. The investigation required careful coordination between local law enforcement and federal agencies, since the insurance fraud aspects of the case fell under federal jurisdiction. The experience of working closely with Marcus on a high-stakes investigation revealed aspects of his character that impressed me even more than his personal quality. He was methodical and thorough in his approach to evidence gathering, but he was also creative in developing new investigative strategies when traditional methods proved insufficient. More importantly, Marcus understood the human cost of the crimes we were investigating. He never lost sight of the fact that behind every case file was a woman whose life had been stolen by someone who was supposed to love and protect her. His empathy for victims and their families motivated his work in ways that went beyond professional obligation. Dr. Hawthorne's arrest and conviction provided a sense of closure that was different from the satisfaction I had felt during the Morrison trial. This case represented my ability to prevent other families from experiencing what mine had endured, rather than simply seeking justice for crimes that had already been committed. The success of our collaboration led to other joint investigations, and Marcus and I developed a professional partnership that enhanced both of our careers while strengthening our personal relationship. We became known within law enforcement circles as a team that could handle complex cases involving domestic violence and financial crimes that targeted women. Our personal relationship continued to evolve alongside our professional partnership. Marcus proposed to me on the second anniversary of our first coffee date, in the same downtown cafe where we had initially met. The proposal was characteristically thoughtful and understated, reflecting his understanding that I would prefer an intimate moment to a public spectacle. The engagement ring he offered was a simple band with a small but flawless diamond, elegant and timeless rather than ostentatious. The contrast with the elaborate ring James had given me, with its emphasis on displaying wealth rather than expressing genuine feeling, was exactly what I needed to see to know that Marcus understood who I was and what I valued. Our wedding was a small ceremony attended by family and close friends, held in a garden setting that emphasized natural beauty over expensive decoration. Isabella served as my maid of honor, having overcome her social anxiety enough to participate fully in the celebration. David Morrison attended as one of Marcus's groomsmen, symbolizing the unlikely friendship that had developed between us during the long process of bringing his family to justice. My parents were visibly emotional during the ceremony, seeing their daughter marry someone who clearly cherished her rather than viewing her as an asset to be acquired and potentially disposed of when convenient. Marcus's family welcomed me warmly, understanding that our relationship represented healing and hope after the trauma we had both experienced in our previous lives. The wedding reception was held at a historic hotel in downtown Portland, with decorations that emphasized personal meaning rather than social status. We displayed photographs of our families and friends rather than expensive floral arrangements, and we served food that reflected our cultural backgrounds rather than conforming to expectations of formal dining. The most meaningful moment of the reception came when Isabella offered a toast to our marriage. She spoke about the strength our family had discovered through adversity, and how witnessing Marcus's patient love for me had restored her faith in the possibility of genuine romantic partnership. Elena taught me that survival isn't just about living through terrible things, Isabella said, raising her glass to the assembled guests. it's about refusing to let those things define who you become. Marcus has shown us what love looks like when it's based on respect and equality, rather than control and possession. Her words captured something essential about the journey I had traveled, from the naive public defender who had nearly been poisoned at her engagement party to the federal prosecutor who had married a man who understood her strength and supported her independence. The honeymoon Marcus and I took was deliberately chosen to be different from the European trip James had planned for. Instead of expensive hotels and tourist destinations designed to impress others, we chose a quiet cabin in the Oregon mountains where we could hike and read and simply enjoy each other's company without external pressures or expectations. The simplicity of our honeymoon reflected the values that had emerged from my experience with the Morrison family. I had learned to prioritize authentic experiences over impressive appearances, genuine connection over social status, and personal growth over external validation. But even as I celebrated the new life Marcus and I were building together, I remained committed to the work that had emerged from my personal trauma. The Morrison case had revealed systemic problems in how law enforcement and the legal system handled crimes against women, particularly when those crimes were committed by people with wealth and social connection. I had been invited to serve on a federal task force examining domestic violence and financial crimes, with a mandate to develop new investigative techniques and legal strategies for cases involving sophisticated criminal organizations. The work required extensive travel and often demanded long hours, but it represented an opportunity to create lasting change rather than simply responding to individual crimes after they had been committed. Marcus was supportive of my commitment to this work, understanding that it represented not just professional ambition, but a moral obligation that had emerged from my personal experience. He often joined me at conferences and training sessions, contributing his own expertise, while ensuring that I had emotional support during the difficult process of reliving traumatic experiences for the purpose of helping others. The federal task force work led to the development of new protocols for investigating suspicious deaths involving women whose husbands or partners stood to benefit financially from their death. We created training materials for medical examiners, law enforcement officers, and insurance investigators that helped them recognize patterns that might indicate murder disguised as accident or natural causes. Most importantly, we established networks of communication between agencies that had previously operated in isolation, ensuring that suspicious patterns could be identified even when individual deaths occurred in different jurisdictions. The Morrison family had been able to operate for 15 years, partly because their crimes were spread across multiple states and countries, making it difficult for any single agency to recognize the scope of their activity. The changes we implemented through the federal task force would have prevented many of the Morrison family's crimes from succeeding, and they continued to protect women whose partners might otherwise view murder as a practical solution to marital problems. The knowledge that my personal trauma had contributed to systemic changes that protected other women provided a sense of purpose that made the difficult journey worthwhile. 3 years after my marriage to Marcus, I received news that provided a different kind of closure to my experience with the Morrison family. James Morrison had been found dead in his federal prison cell, having apparently committed suicide during the night. The circumstances of his death were investigated thoroughly, but no evidence of foul play was discovered. My reaction to James's death surprised me with its complexity. I felt no satisfaction or sense of revenge fulfilled, but rather a kind of sad relief that his story had finally ended. The man who had tried to poison me at our engagement party, who had planned my murder with cold calculation, who had shown no remorse for the women his family had killed, would never again pose a threat to anyone. But James's death also meant that the families of his victims would never receive the full accountability they deserved. His death ended any possibility of appeals or new revelations that might have provided additional closure for the people whose lives had been shattered by his crimes. Patricia Morrison remained in federal prison, serving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. She had adapted to prison life with the same calculating efficiency she had brought to organizing murders, becoming a library clerk, and maintaining correspondence with supporters who continued to believe in her innocence despite the overwhelming evidence of her guilt. Whitfield had also been found dead in her cell 6 months earlier, though her death was ruled a homicide committed by another prisoner who had lost her own daughter to domestic violence. The irony of her death was not lost on the law enforcement community that had worked to bring her to justice. The Morrison law firm had been dissolved, its assets liquidated to pay restitution to victims' families. The building that had housed their offices was eventually converted into a community center, providing legal services to low-income families, a transformation that seemed appropriate, given the contrast between their criminal activities and the legitimate legal work now being conducted in the same space. David Morrison had used his share of the family assets to establish a foundation, providing support to women fleeing domestic violence, particularly those whose abusers had sufficient resources to pursue them across state or international borders. His work with the foundation had become his full-time focus, representing his commitment to atoning for his family's crimes through positive action. My relationship with David had evolved into a genuine friendship based on our shared understanding of how families could be destroyed by secrets and criminal behavior. He had become a valuable ally in my federal task force work, contributing his expertise in financial investigations while supporting the therapeutic work I was doing with other survivors of domestic violence. The foundation David established had helped dozens of women escape dangerous situations and rebuild their lives in safety. Many of these women had stories similar to mine, having discovered that their partners or family members were involved in criminal activities that posed direct threats to their survival. Working with these women through David's foundation had taught me that my experience with the Morrison family, traumatic as it had been, was part of a larger pattern of violence against women that crossed economic and social boundaries. Wealth and education provided resources for more sophisticated crimes, but the underlying dynamics of control and elimination remained consistent across different demographic groups. The therapeutic work I did through the foundation also contributed to my own continued healing. Helping other women process their trauma and develop strategies for rebuilding their lives provided perspective on my own journey, while reinforcing the skills I had developed for distinguishing between reasonable caution and paralyzing fear. One of the women I worked with through the foundation was Sarah Chen, a software engineer whose husband had attempted to kill her by tampering with her car's braking system after she discovered his embezzlement from their joint business. Sarah had survived the accident but had suffered serious injuries that ended her engineering career and forced her to completely rebuild her professional identity. Sarah's story resonated with me because of the parallels in how we had both been forced to reconstruct our lives after discovering that people we trusted had been planning our death. Her experience of learning to trust again while maintaining appropriate vigilance reflected the same challenges I had faced in my relationship with Marcus. Through our work together, Sarah and I developed a friendship that provided mutual support during the ongoing process of healing from betrayal trauma. We found that sharing our experiences with someone who truly understood the psychological impact of discovering murder plots helped us process emotions and fears that were difficult to explain to people who hadn't faced similar situations. Sarah eventually became romantically involved with another foundation volunteer, a former police officer who had left law enforcement after being injured in the line of duty. Their relationship developed slowly and carefully, with both partners understanding the importance of patience and transparency when trust had been shattered by previous trauma. Watching Sarah rebuild her life and develop a healthy romantic relationship provided hope and validation for my own journey with Marcus. It demonstrated that recovery from betrayal trauma was possible, and that the trust issues that emerged from such experiences could be overcome with patience, understanding, and commitment to honest communication. The success stories I witnessed through the foundation work balanced the difficult realities of the criminal cases I prosecuted through my federal position. While my prosecution work focused on bringing justice to perpetrators of violence against women, the foundation work demonstrated the possibility of healing and renewal for survivors of such violence. Both aspects of my work contributed to a sense of purpose that had emerged from my personal trauma, but extended far beyond revenge or personal satisfaction. I had discovered that my experience with the Morrison family had given me unique insights and skills that could benefit other women facing similar threats, and that transformation had become the most meaningful aspect of my professional and personal identity. 5 years after my wedding to Marcus, we decided to expand our family through adoption. The decision reflected our shared commitment to providing stability and love to children who had experienced trauma or loss, much as we had both found healing through our relationship with each other. We adopted Emma, a 7-year-old girl whose mother had been killed by her father in a domestic violence incident that had similarities to the Morrison family's crime. Emma had been in foster care for 2 years, and she came to us with trust issues and behavioral challenges that reflected her traumatic early experiences. Adopting Emma required us to develop new skills for providing support to someone whose trauma was different from our own but equally profound. Emma's father had killed her mother in a fit of rage rather than through the calculated planning that characterized the Morrison crimes, but the impact on her sense of safety and trust was similar to what Isabella and I had experienced. Marcus and I worked with child psychologist and trauma specialist to create an environment where Emma could heal while learning to trust again. The process was challenging and often emotionally exhausting, but it was also deeply rewarding as we watched Emma gradually develop confidence and security in our family. Emma's presence in our home brought new perspective to my understanding of how violence affects families across generations. Her resilience and capacity for growth despite her traumatic experiences reminded me that healing was possible even for children who had witnessed the worst of human behavior. The experience of parenting Emma also strengthened my relationship with Marcus by giving us shared purpose beyond our individual careers and interests. We discovered that our complementary skills and approaches to problem-solving made us effective partners in providing the stability and support Emma needed to thrive. As Emma settled into our family and began to flourish academically and socially, Marcus and I decided to adopt again. Our second adoption was of twin boys Michael and Daniel, whose parents had died in a car accident caused by their father's drunk driving. The boys were 5 years old when they came to us, and they brought different challenges related to survivor guilt and the traumatic loss of both parents simultaneously. Creating a blended family with 3 adopted children who had all experienced significant trauma required us to develop systems and routines that provided maximum stability and predictability. We learned to recognize triggers and warning signs that might indicate emerging emotional difficulties, and we became advocates for our children within educational and social service systems that were often inadequately prepared to support children with complex needs. The work of building our family paralleled the professional work I was doing with the Federal Task Force and the Foundation. All of it involved creating safety and support for people whose trust had been shattered by violence or betrayal, and all of it required patience, consistency, and commitment to healing rather than quick fixes. Our family life provided grounding and perspective that enhanced my professional effectiveness while ensuring that I maintained healthy boundaries between work and personal life. Coming home to children who needed homework help and bedtime stories reminded me that life contained joy and hope alongside the darkness I encountered in my criminal justice work. Emma, Michael, and Daniel had all experienced the worst that adults could inflict on children, but they had also experienced the possibility of recovery and renewal through love and stability. Their presence in our lives served as daily reminders that trauma did not have to define a person's future, and that healing was possible even after profound betrayal and loss. The children also provided motivation for continuing the systemic change work I was doing through the Federal Task Force. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing case files in my downtown office. Detective Rodriguez from the Portland Police Bureau had discovered something that would bring my story full circle in a way I never could have anticipated. "Elena, we need you to come down to the station," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying an urgency that immediately captured my attention. "We've arrested someone in connection with a poisoning case, and she's specifically asking to speak with you." I arrived at the police station within 30 minutes, curious about who would request my involvement in their case. Rodriguez led me to an interview room where a woman in her early 40s sat handcuffed to the table, her expensive clothing and perfectly styled hair suggesting wealth and status despite her current circumstance. "Elena Vasquez," the woman said as I entered the room, her voice carrying a mixture of desperation and calculation. "I've been following your career since the Morrison trials. My name is Catherine Wells, and I need your help." Catherine's story unfolded over the next hour, revealing another layer of the criminal network that had grown around the Morrison family's activities. She had been married to Dr. Richard Wells, a prominent cardiologist whose first wife had died under suspicious circumstances 5 years earlier. Catherine had recently discovered that Richard was planning to poison her using methods similar to those employed by the Morrison family. "He's been putting something in my coffee for weeks," Catherine explained, her hands shaking as she spoke. "I started feeling sick every morning, dizzy and nauseous, but the symptoms would improve throughout the day. When I switched to making my own coffee at work, the symptoms stopped completely." Catherine had done her own investigation, discovering that her husband had been in contact with Dr. Whitfield before her arrest. She had found emails discussing specific dosing strategies for gradual poisoning that would create the appearance of developing illness rather than sudden death. "I confronted him last night," Catherine continued. "I told him I knew what he was doing, and he didn't even try to deny it. He said I was becoming too expensive to maintain, and that my death would solve several financial problems he was facing." The confrontation had escalated into physical violence when Catherine threatened to go to the police. In self-defense, she had struck her husband with a kitchen knife, inflicting wounds that proved fatal. She had called 911 immediately, but the responding officers had arrested her for murder despite her claims of self-defense. "I need someone who understands what these men are capable of," Catherine said, meeting my eyes with desperate intensity. "The police think I'm lying about the poisoning because they can't find any evidence of it in our home. Richard was too smart to leave obvious traces." Catherine's case presented legal and moral complexities that required careful consideration. While she had killed her husband, she had done so to prevent her own murder by someone who had been systematically poisoning her for weeks. The challenge would be proving the gradual poisoning in court when Dr. Wells had been careful to leave no obvious evidence. I agreed to consult on Catherine's case, working with her defense attorney to develop a strategy that would demonstrate the pattern of abuse and attempted murder that had led to the fatal confrontation. The case required expertise in toxicology, domestic violence dynamics, and the sophisticated murder methods that had been pioneered by the Morrison network. Blood tests revealed traces of compounds in Catherine's system that were consistent with gradual poisoning, though the levels were low enough that they might have been missed in routine medical examinations. More importantly, we discovered that Wells had been researching the same poison methods used by Dr. Whitfield, and had been in communication with other doctors who had expressed interest in eliminating inconvenient spouses. The investigation revealed that Dr. Wells had been part of a loose network of medical professionals who shared information about untraceable poisons and murder methods. The network had continued operating even after Dr. Whitfield's arrest, with members developing new techniques and sharing strategies through encrypted communication. Catherine's case became a landmark prosecution of self-defense against domestic violence, establishing legal precedents for women who killed abusive partners to prevent their own murder. The case also led to the discovery of the medical professional network that had grown around the Morrison family's original operations. Working on Catherine's defense brought back many of the emotions I had experienced during my own ordeal with the Morrison family. The similarities between our situations were striking, though Catherine had been more suspicious of her husband's behavior and had acted to protect herself before the poisoning could prove fatal. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with expert testimony about the effects of gradual poisoning and the psychological impact of discovering that a trusted partner was attempting murder. Catherine was ultimately acquitted of murder charges, with the jury accepting that she had acted in reasonable self-defense against someone who was actively trying to kill her. The publicity surrounding Catherine's case led to inquiries from other women who suspected their partners of attempting to poison them. Over the following months, I consulted on dozens of cases involving suspicious illnesses, unexplained symptoms, and gradual health deterioration that might have indicated poisoning attempt. Many of these cases led to criminal investigations that uncovered additional members of the medical professional network that had emerged from the Morrison family's activity. We discovered that the elimination of inconvenient spouses had become a cottage industry among certain medical professionals who viewed it as a lucrative side business. The network included doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and laboratory technicians who provided various services related to murder by poisoning. Some specialized in developing untraceable compounds, others provided false medical records or toxicology reports, and still others offered consulting services for staging deaths to appear accidental or natural. The scope of the network was larger than anything we had discovered during the original Morrison investigation. It included members in over 20 states and several foreign countries, with sophisticated communication systems and financial arrangements that made it difficult for law enforcement to track their activity. My work in exposing this network became the focus of my federal task force activities for the next 2 years. We developed new investigative techniques specifically designed to identify and prosecute medical professionals who were using their expertise to facilitate murder. The investigation led to over 40 arrests and convictions, effectively dismantling the network that had grown around the Morrison family's original operation. More importantly, it led to changes in medical licensing and oversight procedures that made it more difficult for healthcare professionals to obtain and misuse dangerous substances. The success of these investigations established my reputation as the leading federal prosecutor specializing in cases involving medical professionals who committed crimes against their patients or family members. I received invitations to speak at medical conferences and law enforcement training programs, sharing insights about how to recognize and prevent these sophisticated crimes. But the most meaningful aspect of this work was the direct impact it had on protecting women who might otherwise have become victims of poisoning attempts. Every case we solved, every network member we arrested, every policy change we implemented potentially saved lives by making it more difficult for dangerous people to access the tools and knowledge they needed to commit these crimes. My personal life continued to flourish alongside my professional success. Emma, Michael and Daniel had all adjusted well to our family structure and were thriving academically and socially. Emma had developed a particular interest in forensic science, inspired by her understanding of how my work helped protect families like ours. Marcus had been promoted to detective captain, overseeing investigations of violent crimes against women throughout the Portland metropolitan area. His work complemented mine perfectly, with his local investigations often providing leads for my federal cases, while my federal resources supported his local prosecution. Our marriage had deepened through our shared commitment to protecting vulnerable people and our collaborative approach to both parenting and professional challenges. We had learned to balance the emotional demands of our work with the need to maintain stability and security for our children. The 10th anniversary of my staged death provided an opportunity to reflect on the journey I had traveled, from the naive public defender who had nearly been poisoned at her engagement party to the federal prosecutor who had dismantled multiple criminal networks dedicated to killing women. The anniversary also marked a decade since Isabella had been poisoned in my place, an event that had saved my life while traumatizing my sister and forever changing our family's understanding of how evil could hide behind facades of respectability and social status. Isabella had become a successful pharmaceutical researcher, focusing on developing antidotes for exotic poisons and improving detection methods for forensic toxicology. Her work was directly inspired by her experience as a poisoning victim, and she often collaborated with law enforcement agencies on cases involving suspected poisoning. My parents had aged gracefully, taking pride in their daughter's professional achievements, while maintaining the close family bonds that had been strengthened through our shared trauma. They often cared for our children while Marcus and I traveled for work, providing stability and cultural connection that enriched our family life. David Morrison had married a woman he met through his foundation work, someone who shared his commitment to helping victims of domestic violence and his understanding of how families could be destroyed by criminal behavior. Their wedding had been a celebration of redemption and hope, demonstrating that healing was possible even for families that had been shattered by terrible choices. The Morrison family estate had been converted into a residential facility for women fleeing domestic violence, providing safe housing and support services for families who needed protection from dangerous partners. The transformation of the property from a place where murders were planned to a sanctuary for potential victims seemed symbolically appropriate. My own relationship with the Morrison legacy was complex, but ultimately peaceful. I felt no satisfaction in their destruction, but rather a sense of closure that came from knowing their capacity to harm others had been permanently eliminated. The work I had done to expose their crimes and dismantle the networks they had created represented the most meaningful contribution I could make to preventing similar tragedy. Looking back on the decade that had passed since that fateful engagement party, I recognized that my experience with James Morrison and his family had fundamentally shaped who I had become, but it no longer defined my identity or limited my possibility. The woman who had trusted too easily and believed too deeply in love had learned to distinguish between genuine affection and calculated manipulation. The prosecutor who had emerged from that betrayal had developed skills and insights that protected other women from experiencing similar violence. The wife and mother I had become had created a family based on honesty, mutual respect, and shared commitment to helping others heal from trauma. The federal task force work I continued to pursue represented a legacy that extended far beyond personal revenge to encompass systemic changes that would protect future generations of women. The final chapter of my story with the Morrison family came when Patricia Morrison died in federal prison, her death marking the end of the criminal enterprise that had claimed so many lives over 15 years. Her death was ruled natural causes, the result of cancer that had gone undiagnosed and untreated during her incarceration. I felt no emotion upon hearing news of Patricia Morrison's death, neither satisfaction nor sadness, but rather a quiet recognition that the last direct threat from that family had been permanently eliminated. Her death represented the final closing of a chapter that had begun with poisoned wine at an engagement party and had evolved into a decade-long commitment to protecting other women from similar violence. The work continues. Every day brings new cases of domestic violence, financial crimes targeting women, and sophisticated attempts to disguise murder as accident or natural causes. The networks I helped dismantle have been replaced by new criminal organizations with similar goals and updated methods. But the systems we developed for investigating these crimes, the protocols we established for recognizing suspicious patterns, and the training programs we implemented for law enforcement and medical professionals, continue to protect women whose partners might otherwise view murder as a practical solution to relationship problems. The foundation David Morrison established continues to help women escape dangerous situations and rebuild their lives in safety. The residential facility created from the Morrison family estate continues to provide sanctuary for families fleeing violence. The changes in medical licensing and oversight procedures continue to make it more difficult for healthcare professionals to misuse their access to dangerous substances. Most importantly, the 3 children Marcus and I adopted continue to thrive and grow, demonstrating daily that trauma does not have to define a person's future and that healing is possible even after profound betrayal and loss. Emma is now applying to colleges with strong forensic science programs, determined to follow in my footsteps by using scientific methods to solve crimes and protect vulnerable people. Michael and Daniel have developed interests in social work and psychology inspired by their own healing process and their desire to help other children who have experienced trauma. Our family represents the possibility of creating something beautiful and meaningful from the ashes of terrible experiences. We are living proof that betrayal and violence do not have to win, that love and commitment can overcome even the most calculated attempts at destruction. The glass of wine that nearly killed me 10 years ago led to the discovery of a criminal enterprise that had claimed dozens of lives. The sister who drank that poison in my place survived to become a researcher dedicated to preventing similar crimes. The staged death that exposed my would-be killers launched a career dedicated to protecting other women from experiencing similar violence. Every woman who escapes a dangerous relationship because of the networks we establish, every poison victim who survives because of the detection methods we developed, every medical professional who chooses ethical behavior because of the oversight systems we implemented, represents a victory that extends far beyond personal revenge. The Morrison family tried to eliminate what they saw as a problem, a woman whose independence and legal knowledge posed a threat to their criminal operation. Instead, they created their most effective enemy, someone with the motivation, skills and resources to dismantle everything they had built on the foundation of murdered wives and grieving widowers. Their attempt to poison me at my own engagement party, intended to be the perfect crime that would eliminate a threat while appearing to be a tragic accident, instead became the catalyst for a transformation that has protected countless other women from experiencing similar violence. The face that James Morrison made when he realized I was still alive, when he understood that his perfect murder plot had failed and that his entire world was about to collapse, remains one of the most satisfying moments of my life. But it was satisfaction that came not from revenge but from justice, not from destruction but from protection. That moment represented the beginning of a new chapter rather than the end of an old one. It was the moment when I stopped being a victim and became a force for change, when I transformed personal trauma into professional purpose, when I discovered that the most powerful response to betrayal was not anger but action. 10 years later, I am no longer defined by what James Morrison and his family tried to do to me. I am defined by what I chose to do in response to their actions, by the lives I have helped save, by the criminal networks I have dismantled, by the family I have built with someone who truly loves and respects me. The wine that nearly killed me became the catalyst for a life more meaningful and impactful than anything I could have imagined as a young public defender planning her wedding to a man who was secretly planning her murder. The betrayal that shattered my trust became the foundation for wisdom that has protected other women from similar deception. The love I thought I had lost when I discovered James's true nature was replaced by something deeper and more genuine with Marcus, a partnership based on mutual respect and shared purpose, rather than calculation and control. The woman who walked into that engagement party 10 years ago, trusting and naive and unprepared for the evil she was about to discover, no longer exists. In her place is someone stronger, wiser, and more effective, someone who has transformed personal trauma into professional mission and individual healing into systemic change. That transformation, more than any legal victory or criminal conviction, represents the true defeat of the Morrison family and everything they represent. They tried to eliminate a threat and instead created a force that would ultimately destroy their entire criminal enterprise and protect countless other women from experiencing similar violence. The glass of wine I was supposed to drink that night would have ended my story before it truly began. Instead, Isabella's survival and my discovery of the truth launched a decade of work that has made the world safer for women whose partners might otherwise view murder as a convenient solution to relationship problems. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.